In the early hours of April 15th, 1912, after the last lifeboat had drifted away and the final sounds faded into the North Atlantic, the world did not yet know what had happened. For several hours, the ocean simply went quiet again, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The ship was gone, but the consequences were only beginning, and they unfolded slowly, awkwardly, and without much dignity. The first people to experience the after were not officials or newspapers or historians. They were the survivors, sitting in overcrowded lifeboats, damp, cold, and unsure whether rescue was coming at all. Many of them did not yet understand that over 1,500 people had died. Some believed the ship was damaged but still afloat. Others assumed another liner would arrive any minute. The human mind, when tired and freezing, tends to cling to optimistic misunderstandings. When the Carpathia finally appeared on the horizon, it was not dramatic. There were no cheers. Just quiet relief, occasional sobbing, and a great deal of silence. Survivors were lifted aboard one by one, wrapped in blankets, given weak tea, and asked their names. Some could answer, some could not. Many stared straight ahead, already beginning the long process of pretending they were fine. On board the Carpathia, the reality settled in slowly. Lifeboats kept arriving. They kept being underfilled. Names were checked, lists were made, crossed out, rewritten. It became clear that far more people were missing than saved. This realization did not cause panic. It caused exhaustion. People cried, then stopped crying, then felt strangely embarrassed about having cried at all. News of the sinking did not reach the outside world cleanly. Early wireless messages were confused and sometimes incorrect. Some reports suggested that all passengers had been rescued. Newspapers printed hopeful headlines that would age badly within hours. Families waited by telegraph offices, reassured by rumors that were technically comforting and emotionally devastating. By the time the Carpathia reached New York, the atmosphere was subdued to the point of discomfort. Crowds gathered, not quite sure how to behave. Survivors disembarked quietly, many without luggage, some without shoes. They were photographed anyway. Questions were asked too soon. Statements were requested before people had slept. Almost immediately, the practical aftermath began. Bodies needed to be recovered. Ships were sent back to the site, not for rescue, but for retrieval. The sea, indifferent as always, gave up some of the dead and kept the rest. Personal effects were catalogued carefully, watches stopped at the same time, letters folded neatly, money still in pockets. Even grief, it turns out, can be itemized. Meanwhile, investigations started. Committees assembled. Testimony was taken in rooms that were warmer and more comfortable than the lifeboats had been. Questions were polite, but relentless. Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why was the ship moving so fast? Why were warnings ignored? The answers were unsatisfying in a familiar way. Confidence, tradition, cost-saving. Assumptions that had worked well enough until they didn't. For the shipping industry, changes followed. Safety regulations were updated. Lifeboat requirements were increased. Wireless operators were required to stay on duty at all times. These reforms were sensible, overdue, and very much too late for the people they were meant to protect. For survivors, however, there was no neat resolution. Some became famous against their will. Some gave interviews for years. Others never spoke of the night again. Many lived long lives carrying a quiet weight that never quite lifted. Survival, it turned out, was not the end of the story. It was simply the beginning of a much slower, less visible chapter. And for the world, the sinking became something else entirely. A symbol, a cautionary tale, a story retold so often that the reality blurred into legend. But in those first days after the ship disappeared beneath the water, it was not yet history. It was paperwork, cold tea, unanswered telegrams, and people trying very hard to sit still while everything they trusted quietly slipped away. The days that followed did not move quickly. They moved in paperwork, in waiting rooms, and in conversations that stopped mid-sentence. For many survivors, the immediate problem was not grief, but logistics. They needed clothes. They needed money. They needed to get home. Some had lost everything except the coat they were wearing, and even that was usually borrowed. Hotels in New York filled quietly with people who did not know how long they would be staying. Staff learned not to ask questions. Meals went half-eaten. Letters were written and rewritten because it was difficult to explain what had happened without sounding unreal. Many survivors discovered that describing the event made it feel less real, not more, so they stopped trying. Families of the missing entered a different phase of waiting. Recovery ships returned with bodies, but not enough. Lists were published. Names appeared, disappeared, and sometimes reappeared with corrections. Some families held funerals without remains, others delayed everything, convinced that a mistake had been made, that their person had simply been overlooked. Hope lingered long past its practical usefulness. Insurance companies became involved almost immediately. Claims were filed, values were assessed, lives were reduced to policies and payouts. The sums varied dramatically, reflecting the rigid class structure that had existed on the ship and continued comfortably on land. For some families, compensation arrived quickly. For others, it never really covered anything at all. Public attention intensified, then shifted. For a few weeks, the Titanic was everywhere. Editorials scolded arrogance, sermons warned against pride. Songs were written, some respectful, some opportunistic. Then, gradually, other news took over. The world did what it usually does. It moved on, slowly, without asking permission. Inquiries continued behind closed doors and in crowded hearing rooms. Survivors were asked to relive the night in detail. Times were debated. Decisions were scrutinized. Witnesses contradicted each other, not out of dishonesty, but because memory under stress is unreliable. Cold, fear, and exhaustion rearrange events in the mind. Certainty becomes negotiable. The ship's builders defended their design. The crew defended their actions. Everyone defended something. Responsibility was distributed thinly enough that it never settled comfortably on any single person. The phrase "lessons were learned" appeared often, usually without much explanation. Meanwhile, life resumed unevenly for those who lived through it. Some returned to ordinary routines and were surprised by how unchanged everything seemed. Trains still ran, shops still opened, people still complained about trivial things. This normality felt strange, even rude. The world had not paused properly. Others found themselves permanently altered. Sleep became difficult. Loud noises caused sudden alertness. Water was avoided. Ice was avoided. Silence was avoided. Many did not have language for these experiences. They simply adapted, quietly, and rarely spoke about why. The Titanic itself, resting unseen on the ocean floor, began its long transition from wreck to myth. It was talked about as a symbol of human arrogance, of technological overconfidence, of social inequality. All of these were accurate enough. But none of them captured the more mundane truth of the aftermath, which was mostly administrative and emotionally exhausting. The ship did not immediately become legendary. At first, it was inconvenient. It caused delays, arguments, lawsuits, and uncomfortable questions. It forced changes that cost money. It embarrassed powerful people. Only later did it become romanticized, dramatized, and simplified. Years passed, survivors aged. Many died without ever seeing the wreck discovered. Some watched the story resurface again and again, retold by people who had not been there, with increasing confidence. They rarely corrected these versions. Correcting history, like surviving disaster, takes energy. And so the aftermath settled into history, not with a clear ending, but with a gradual fading. The inquiries concluded, the crowds dispersed, the headlines stopped. What remained were individuals carrying a memory that no longer had a public audience, and a ship that would continue to sink, very slowly, in the imagination of the world. As time moved on, the Titanic settled into a quieter, less visible phase of its existence. It was no longer breaking news. It became something people referenced in passing, a cautionary example brought up when discussing progress, technology, or unfortunate overconfidence. For those who had lived through it, this casual use of the disaster felt odd, like hearing strangers discuss a private memory with unnecessary confidence. Legal matters dragged on for years. Lawsuits moved slowly, as they tend to do when responsibility is unclear and the stakes are high. Shipping companies argued over liability. Lawyers argued over definitions. Courts attempted to assign order to something that had happened in darkness, cold, and confusion. The results were technically fair, procedurally correct, and emotionally unsatisfying. Some survivors used the compensation to rebuild their lives. Others found that no amount of money addressed the unease that lingered. A few refused payments entirely, uncomfortable with the idea that survival had been assigned a price. Most accepted whatever was offered and tried not to think about it too much. Practical concerns have a way of overpowering philosophical ones. The crew who survived faced their own difficulties. Some returned to sea quickly, needing work and familiarity. Others could not step onto a ship again without feeling something tighten inside them. Careers quietly changed direction. Maritime confidence, once taken for granted, became something more fragile. Experience had replaced assumption. For families of the dead, the years that followed were marked less by closure and more by adjustment. Birthdays passed. Anniversaries arrived. The absence became part of the household routine. The dead did not fade away so much as they became still. Their stories were told repeatedly at first, then less often, then only when prompted. Memory learned to be efficient. As the decades passed, the Titanic slipped further into abstraction. Children learned about it in school as a historical event, detached from faces and voices. Books were written with diagrams, timelines, and confident conclusions. The disaster was organized into chapters, which made it easier to understand and harder to feel. Occasionally, a survivor would be interviewed late in life. They spoke calmly, often with surprising detachment. Time had sanded down the sharpest edges, or perhaps it had simply taught them how to live around them. They remembered small details more clearly than large ones: a sound, a smell, the way the deck felt underfoot. These details did not fit neatly into narratives, so they were usually edited out. When the wreck was finally discovered decades later, it reignited interest, but in a different way. The ship was no longer a recent tragedy, it was an artifact. Cameras explored it carefully, respectfully, and from a safe distance. The ocean floor revealed plates, railings, shoes. Seeing these things did not bring answers. It brought confirmation. The discovery did not provide closure despite expectations. It provided perspective. The ship was smaller than people imagined. The damage was quieter than anticipated. The ocean had been patient. Time had been thorough. The Titanic had not remained frozen in its final moment. It had continued to decay, unnoticed, for decades. For historians, this was useful. For families, it was complicated. The wreck was both a grave and a curiosity. Debates followed about preservation, access, and respect. These discussions were earnest and unresolved. They still are. By the end of the 20th century, the Titanic had become firmly embedded in popular culture. Films were made, exhibitions toured, souvenirs were sold. The story was told with swelling music and clear heroes and villains. This version was emotionally satisfying, if not entirely accurate. Reality, as usual, had been messier and quieter. Through all of this, the actual aftermath remained understated. There was no single moment when things returned to normal. Normal simply reasserted itself gradually, without announcement. People adapted, systems adjusted, regulations improved. The sea remained unchanged, and perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand what happened after the Titanic sank. There was no clean ending. There was only a long, subdued process of continuing on, carrying memory lightly enough to function, but heavily enough to remember why it mattered. By the time the Titanic reached its 50th anniversary, the people who remembered it firsthand were becoming scarce. Many survivors had already passed away. Those who remained were elderly, careful with their energy, and selective about which memories they shared. Time had done what time usually does. It softened some things, erased others, and left a few details inexplicably intact. For the wider public, the disaster had become something comfortable to revisit. It was distant enough to feel safe. The horror was acknowledged, but contained. People could discuss it over dinner, or while browsing books, or during documentaries watched from warm living rooms. Tragedy, once far enough away, becomes educational. Museums began displaying recovered artifacts: a teacup, a piece of railing, a pair of shoes. These objects were quiet and unimpressive, which was precisely the point. They were ordinary things that had outlived extraordinary circumstances. Visitors stared at them for long periods, trying to imagine the hands that once used them. The imagination did most of the work. The objects themselves remained stubbornly silent. Meanwhile, the ocean continued its slow dismantling of the wreck. Bacteria consumed iron. Pressure collapsed empty spaces. What had once been a marvel of engineering became a fragile arrangement of rust and sediment. This process did not care about symbolism. It did not pause for anniversaries. It proceeded at a steady pace, indifferent and thorough. For maritime safety experts, the Titanic never stopped being relevant. It was cited in training manuals and lectures, not as a dramatic story, but as a practical case study. Mistakes were cataloged, decisions were analyzed. The goal was not to mourn, but to prevent repetition. This was perhaps the most useful form of remembrance, even if it lacked emotional flair. Descendants of passengers carried the story in quieter ways. Some grew up hearing it often. Others discovered it later, unexpectedly through documents or family conversations. The disaster became part of personal identity, though usually not the most prominent part. It existed in the background, like an inherited accent or an old photograph. Occasionally, debates surfaced about whether the Titanic was remembered too much or too little. Some argued it overshadowed other tragedies. Others insisted it deserved its place. These discussions were rarely resolved. Memory is not a fair system. It preserves what resonates, not what is proportional. As media evolved, so did the way the Titanic was presented. Early accounts were restrained. Later ones became more elaborate. Visual reconstructions improved. Dialogue was invented. Emotions were amplified. Each retelling moved slightly further from the experience of those in the lifeboats and closer to what audiences expected a tragedy to feel like. This shift did not happen maliciously. It happened naturally. Stories adapt to the needs of the present. Accuracy competes with clarity. Subtlety competes with attention spans. The quieter aspects of the aftermath, insurance disputes, administrative reforms, emotional numbness, were less appealing than sweeping narratives of love, loss, and fate. And yet, beneath all the dramatization, the basic truth remained unchanged. After the ship sank, people had to live with it. They had to wake up the next day. They had to explain what happened. They had to pay bills, raise children, return to work. The world did not provide a pause button. Some survivors expressed frustration late in life that people focused so heavily on the sinking itself. The iceberg, the final plunge, the exact angle of the decks. For them, the hardest part had come afterward. The waiting, the explaining, the long stretch of time in which nothing dramatic happened, but everything felt permanently altered. This perspective rarely made it into popular retellings. It lacked spectacle. It required patience. It suggested that disasters do not end cleanly, but dissolve slowly into daily life. This is not a particularly exciting message, but it is an honest one. As the centennial approached, commemorations became more elaborate. Ceremonies were held. Names were read aloud. Ships returned to the site. These events were respectful, measured, and carefully organized. They acknowledged the loss without pretending to resolve it. And after the ceremonies ended, the ocean resumed its quiet routines. Waves rose and fell. Ships passed overhead. The wreck continued to age, unnoticed most of the time. History, once again, retreated into the background. That is how the aftermath ultimately settled. Not with closure, but with continuity. The Titanic did not stop affecting people because enough time had passed. It simply became one of many things the world learned to carry, gently and without ceremony. As the years moved further away from 1912, the Titanic's aftermath became less about direct memory and more about inheritance. Not inheritance in the financial sense, although that did happen, but in the quieter way stories settle into families. A grandmother who avoided boats, a great uncle whose name was never used, a box of letters no one felt quite ready to throw away. For many descendants, the connection surfaced unexpectedly. A school assignment, a documentary watched late at night, a surname appearing on a list. The realization was often strange rather than emotional. The event had happened long before they were born, yet it had quietly shaped the path that led to them. History has a way of doing that, without asking. By this point, the Titanic had become a reference point rather than a wound. It was used to explain safety regulations, to justify caution, to remind people that confidence should be inspected occasionally. The phrase, like the Titanic, entered everyday language, usually incorrectly, and almost always casually. Very few people paused to consider what the comparison implied. Academic interest continued steadily. Papers were written, models were refined, timelines were adjusted by minutes, sometimes seconds. Scholars debated structural failures, human decision-making, and institutional culture. These discussions were detailed, calm, and methodical. They treated the disaster not as a mystery, but as a system that had failed in predictable ways. At the same time, popular culture continued to simplify. Characters became clearer. Motivations became cleaner. The chaos of real experience was edited down into something that fit comfortably into a few hours of storytelling. This made the Titanic easier to remember and harder to truly understand. Survivors who lived into advanced old age often expressed mild discomfort with this transformation. Not outrage, just quiet unease. They recognized the story, but not themselves within it. Their memories were slower, messier, and less heroic. They remembered waiting, not escaping, listening, not shouting, being cold for a very long time. As memory shifted further away from lived experience, the aftermath became almost invisible. The years of adjustment, the marriages affected, the careers redirected, the small decisions influenced by one night in the Atlantic. These things did not fit neatly into anniversaries or exhibits, so they were rarely mentioned. The ship itself continued to deteriorate far below the surface. Expeditions documented its decline carefully. Comparisons were made between earlier footage and later visits. Railings collapsed. Decks gave way. Nature reclaimed what engineering had assembled. This process was predictable, irreversible, and strangely appropriate. There were ongoing debates about whether the wreck should be left alone. Some argued for preservation. others for access. Most agreed on respect, though they defined it differently. The discussions were thoughtful and unresolved. Like much of the Titanic's legacy, they did not end decisively. In classrooms, the Titanic was now a case study. Students learned about lifeboat capacity, chain of command failures, and the importance of redundancy. The human cost was acknowledged, then efficiently summarized. Education requires compression. Something is always lost in the process. Outside of classrooms, people continued to be drawn to the story for reasons they could not always explain. Perhaps it was the scale, perhaps the irony, perhaps the uncomfortable reminder that preparation often lags behind confidence. The Titanic offered all of these without demanding a clear conclusion. What rarely changed was the central reality of the aftermath. There was no moment when everything was resolved, no point at which grief officially ended or lessons were fully absorbed. Instead, there was a gradual incorporation into the background of history, where events remain influential without being constantly examined. This is how most aftermaths behave. They do not announce themselves. They fade slowly, unevenly, and without regard for narrative structure. They leave traces in regulations, habits, and inherited caution. They persist quietly, long after attention has moved elsewhere. And so, long after the sinking itself had become familiar, the consequences continued to ripple outward in subtle ways. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, like the ocean above the wreck, moving on the surface while carrying an entire history below. By the time the Titanic had fully settled into the category of historical inevitability, its aftermath had become something people assumed they already understood. The ship sank. Changes were made. Time passed. This summary was neat, efficient, and slightly misleading. The reality was that the consequences never arrived all at once. They arrived in fragments, spread thinly across decades. One of the quieter effects was a shift in how people thought about safety itself. Before the disaster, safety had often been treated as an optional refinement, something added when convenient or removed when expensive. Afterward, it became harder to justify that attitude openly. Regulations tightened, inspections increased, compliance became less negotiable. These changes were not dramatic. They were administrative. They did not feel heroic, but they lasted. For shipping companies, the Titanic became an unspoken reference in meetings and design discussions. It was rarely mentioned directly, but it hovered in the background. Decisions were framed around avoiding embarrassment as much as avoiding disaster. No one wanted to be responsible for the next obvious oversight. Fear, it turns out, can be a very effective teacher. For passengers, particularly those who traveled by sea in the years that followed, trust became more conditional. People still boarded ships. They still dressed well for the journey. But they noticed things more. They counted lifeboats. They asked questions. They paid attention to drills they once ignored. The confidence of the previous era had not vanished, but it had been adjusted downward. The Titanic also left its mark on how disasters were discussed publicly. Investigations became expected. Transparency became a selling point. Companies learned that silence looked worse than admission, even when admission was uncomfortable. This did not prevent future failures, but it changed how they were managed afterward. The aftermath of the Titanic had taught institutions how to perform accountability, even when actual responsibility remained diffuse. Meanwhile, individual lives continued quietly. Survivors married, worked, moved cities, and grew old. Some mentioned the Titanic occasionally in the way one mentions an illness long recovered from. Others avoided the topic entirely. Their experiences did not align neatly with the dramatic arc that history preferred. They were too long, too ordinary, and too unresolved. For families who had lost someone, the aftermath remained personal rather than historical. Anniversaries were observed privately. Names were remembered without ceremony. Grief, once stripped of public attention, became something managed internally. There was no expectation that it should ever fully disappear. As generations passed, the Titanic's lessons became abstract. New disasters occurred. New technologies inspired new confidence. Each era believed itself better prepared than the last. The Titanic was cited as evidence of progress, even as similar patterns quietly reappeared elsewhere. History is good at warning. It is less effective at being obeyed. The ship itself continued to decay, its deterioration mirroring the slow erosion of first-hand memory. As steel weakened and structures collapsed, the wreck became less recognizable. Expeditions noted this with a tone of mild surprise, as though time's effects were somehow unexpected. Nothing built to last forever eventually proves the point. There were moments when interest surged again: anniversaries, new discoveries, cultural releases. Each brought the story back into focus briefly, before it receded once more. The aftermath, however, never returned with the same clarity. it remained diffuse, scattered across policies, habits, and inherited caution. What made the Titanic's aftermath distinctive was not its scale, but its persistence. It refused to conclude neatly. It lingered in regulations still followed, in phrases still used, in assumptions quietly revised. It influenced decisions made by people who had never thought consciously about the ship at all. In this way, the Titanic became less of an event and more of a condition, a reminder embedded into systems rather than stories. It existed not only in museums and books, but in procedures, checklists, and expectations. Its presence was subtle, almost invisible, which is often where lasting influence prefers to reside. And so the aftermath continued, not as a dramatic chapter, but as a background process. It did not demand attention. It simply persisted. Like the ocean itself, it moved steadily, shaping outcomes without announcing its intentions. As the 20th century progressed, the Titanic's aftermath became increasingly indirect. People no longer felt its influence through memory, but through habits that seemed entirely ordinary. Safety drills that felt routine, emergency procedures that felt obvious, design choices that were rarely questioned. These things existed not because people remembered the Titanic, but because someone, long ago, had learned to worry. In this way, the disaster blended into the infrastructure of daily life. It became invisible, which is often mistaken for irrelevance. In reality, it had simply succeeded at what aftermaths are supposed to do. It had altered behavior quietly enough that no one felt the need to announce it anymore. For historians, this created a subtle problem. The sinking itself was easy to document. The iceberg, the timeline, the casualty figures. The aftermath, however, resisted clean description. It stretched too far forward. It diffused too widely. It appeared in places that were difficult to trace directly back to a single night in 1912. Cause and effect became politely entangled. As a result, many accounts compressed the story. The Titanic sank, reforms followed, and the lesson was learned. This version was efficient clarifying, and not entirely wrong. It was simply incomplete. The truth was that lessons were learned unevenly, adopted gradually, and occasionally forgotten, only to be relearned later under different names. In everyday conversation, the Titanic became shorthand, a metaphor for failure, a warning about arrogance, a reminder that size does not equal safety. These comparisons were useful, but they also dulled the specificity of what had actually happened afterward. Metaphors tend to flatten nuance. The real aftermath had been anything but simple. Meanwhile, the wreck continued its slow transformation. By this point, experts spoke openly about its eventual disappearance. Corrosion advanced, structural integrity weakened. The ship was not being preserved by time. It was being erased by it. This knowledge did not alarm anyone. It felt appropriate. Nothing stays intact forever, especially not mistakes. For families still connected to the story, the gradual vanishing of the wreck was met with mixed feelings. Some felt relief, others felt loss. Most felt something harder to name. The physical remains mattered less than the fact that the story would eventually exist only in records and retellings. This, too, is a kind of ending, though it arrives without ceremony. The Titanic's aftermath also influenced how people talked about risk. Confidence became something to be justified rather than assumed. Experts were expected to explain themselves. Systems were expected to fail safely. These expectations did not eliminate disasters, but they changed the tone of response. Surprise was less acceptable. Accountability became part of the script. At the same time, there was a tendency to believe that such a disaster could not happen again in the same way. Technologies improved, monitoring increased, communication accelerated. Each advancement created reassurance, along with new vulnerabilities. The Titanic's aftermath warned against this comfort, though the warning was rarely acknowledged directly. What endured was not fear, but caution, not panic, but procedure, the kind of restraint that feels boring when it works. This is the least celebrated form of legacy, and often the most effective. The Titanic did not change the world through drama. It changed it through paperwork. In personal lives, echoes remain subtle. A reluctance to travel by sea passed down without explanation. A family story told once and then avoided. A preference shaped by something no longer fully remembered. These influences rarely announced their origins. They simply existed. By now, the Titanic had become something paradoxical. It was one of the most famous disasters in history, yet its most important effects were the ones least often mentioned. The aftermath had succeeded by becoming background. It had folded itself into the ordinary. And perhaps that is where it was always headed. Not toward a clear moral or a final reckoning, but toward gradual absorption into how things are done. The Titanic sank loudly. Its aftermath did not. It settled in quietly, adjusted expectations, and stayed. As the story continued to age, the Titanic's aftermath became less about memory and more about maintenance. Not emotional maintenance, but institutional maintenance. Checklists were updated. Procedures were revised. Redundancies were added, then quietly tested, then taken for granted. Most people using these systems never wondered why they existed. They simply accepted that someone, somewhere, had been cautious enough to insist on them. This is how large disasters usually finish their work. Not with reflection, but with routine. For much of the 20th century, the Titanic was referenced less as an event and more as a benchmark. It represented the moment when confidence exceeded preparation by an unacceptable margin. Engineers, regulators, and safety planners did not need to retell the story in detail. A single mention was enough. Everyone understood what was implied, even if they had never read the transcripts or studied the diagrams. At the same time, the emotional distance continued to grow. Each generation encountered the Titanic for the first time without any sense of urgency. It was introduced alongside other historical events, neatly bounded by dates and outcomes. Students learned what went wrong, nodded at the conclusions, and moved on. The aftermath, by now, had become too spread out to feel personal. In popular imagination, the focus narrowed again. The sinking itself remained compelling. The aftermath did not. It was slower, less visual, and largely administrative. Stories about committees, regulations, and long-term adjustment rarely hold attention. They also happen to be the most accurate description of what followed. As a result, the idea formed that the Titanic's story ended when the ship disappeared beneath the water. Everything after that was treated as an epilogue. This framing was convenient but misleading. The epilogue, in reality, was the longest part. Institutions carried this epilogue forward without ceremony. Maritime law evolved incrementally. International cooperation increased. Standards became standardized. These developments were never credited to a single event, but the influence remained. The Titanic had shifted expectations permanently, even as its name receded from daily use. Meanwhile, interest in the wreck itself continued in cycles. New technology made deeper exploration possible. Images improved, mapping became more precise. Each advancement brought renewed attention, followed by renewed debate. Should artifacts be recovered? Should the site be left alone? Who gets to decide? These questions produced no final answers, only temporary agreements. Over time, the wreck became less of a destination and more of a reference. Scientists spoke about it as an environment, a place where metal, bacteria, and pressure interacted in predictable ways. The ship was no longer exceptional. It was an example. This transition, while intellectually useful, felt emotionally odd to those who still saw it as a grave. For the general public, the Titanic remained oddly comforting. It was tragic, but contained. The scale was immense, but finite. The causes were complex, but explainable. The lessons were clear enough to summarize. In a world of ongoing crises with no resolution, the Titanic offered a disaster with a beginning, a middle, and an apparent end. Except, of course, it didn't. The aftermath persisted in less obvious ways. In how organizations responded to failure, in how investigations were expected to unfold, in the confirmation that disasters should be studied calmly rather than sensationally, even if public attention rarely followed that preference. For individuals, the story continued to surface unexpectedly. A documentary watched late at night, a museum visit that lingered longer than expected, a quiet realization that the past was closer than it seemed. These moments rarely felt dramatic. They were reflective, brief, and often unshared. As the century turned, the Titanic became increasingly symbolic of a certain kind of modern anxiety, the fear that systems appear stable right up until they aren't, the discomfort of knowing that confidence can coexist with oversight, the suspicion that progress does not eliminate risk, it reorganizes it. None of these realizations arrived loudly. They did not announce themselves as lessons learned. They settled into general awareness, where they remained half-acknowledged and easily forgotten, until something else reminded people again. And so the aftermath continued its quiet work. It did not insist on being remembered correctly. It did not require emotional engagement. It simply remained available, waiting to be noticed when circumstances aligned. The Titanic sank once. Its aftermath never really stopped. It thinned out, stretched forward, and blended into everything that came after. Not as a warning constantly repeated, but as a background adjustment, shaping expectations without explanation. This is not a satisfying ending, but it is an accurate one. Aftermaths rarely conclude. They taper. They fade. They become habits. And if that feels anticlimactic, it is worth remembering that anticlimax is often how real consequences behave. They do not demand attention. They quietly insist on change, then wait to see if anyone notices. As the Titanic moved deeper into the past, its aftermath began to resemble something familiar rather than remarkable. It became part of the general background noise of modern history, referenced often enough to feel known, but rarely examined closely enough to feel fresh. This familiarity made it easier to forget how long the consequences actually unfolded. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, most people encountered the Titanic first through summaries, a paragraph in a textbook, a short documentary clip, a dramatic recreation that condensed hours into minutes and years into a closing caption. These versions were not wrong, but they were selective. They focused on the moment of failure, not the long stretch of adjustment that followed. Institutions, meanwhile, continued operating under assumptions shaped indirectly by the disaster. Safety margins existed because someone had once calculated them too narrowly. Emergency protocols were rehearsed because previous ones had been improvised. Redundancy was built into systems because confidence alone had proven insufficient. None of this required remembering the Titanic explicitly. The influence had already been absorbed. This absorption created an illusion of completion. It felt as though the Titanic's story had been fully processed, lessons learned, changes made, file closed. But history rarely works that cleanly. The aftermath did not end. It simply stopped being associated with its origin in everyday thought. Occasionally, a reminder surfaced. A maritime accident prompted comparisons. An inquiry echoed familiar questions about oversight and responsibility. A new technology inspired optimism that sounded uncomfortably like older optimism. In these moments, the Titanic resurfaced briefly, not as a story, but as a pattern. For families still connected to the event, these moments could feel strange. The disaster that had shaped their history appeared in headlines as metaphor, stripped of specificity. Their private associations did not align neatly with public shorthand. They learned to live with this mismatch, quietly. The wreck itself continued to decline. Reports noted accelerating deterioration. Some sections collapsed entirely. The ship, once rigid and imposing, softened into debris. This physical fading mirrored the gradual thinning of attention. The Titanic was still famous but increasingly abstract. Its material presence mattered less than its symbolic weight. There were renewed calls for preservation, though preservation of what remained was always limited. The environment did not allow for permanence. Even if human activity ceased entirely, the ocean would continue its work. This inevitability was not dramatic, it was steady. It required no effort. In this sense, the Titanic's aftermath shared a trait with the disaster itself. Neither could be stopped once set in motion. The sinking unfolded according to physics. The aftermath unfolded according to human systems, which are slower but just as persistent. Both resisted clean endings. For educators and historians, the challenge remained the same. How to convey the significance of something whose most important effects were invisible. How to teach an aftermath that looked like regulation updates, changed attitudes, and quiet hesitation rather than a single decisive moment. It was easier to teach the iceberg. As a result, the public understanding of the Titanic remained tilted toward spectacle. The ship, the night, the final plunge. The aftermath existed mostly as implication, something assumed rather than explored. This imbalance persisted not because of neglect, but because of narrative preference. Yet the aftermath continued to function regardless of how it was framed. It shaped expectations about responsibility. It normalized investigation. It reinforced the idea that disasters should be analyzed rather than absorbed passively. These were not exciting outcomes, but they were durable ones. In everyday life, traces appeared in subtle ways. A preference for drills over improvisation. A suspicion of claims that something was unsinkable, foolproof, or perfectly safe. These instincts were rarely traced back to a specific origin. They felt like common sense. Common sense, however, usually has a history. As time went on, the Titanic became less a story about loss and more a story about adjustment. How systems react after they fail. How people recalibrate trust. How confidence is moderated without being eliminated entirely. These processes did not belong exclusively to 1912. They repeated quietly, whenever failure occurred elsewhere. This repetition is what allowed the Titanic's aftermath to persist without demanding attention. It became one example among many, even as it remained the most recognizable. Its influence diluted, but did not disappear. It blended into the broader pattern of how modern societies respond to large-scale failure. In this way, the aftermath achieved a kind of anonymity. It no longer required remembrance to function. It operated automatically, embedded into expectations and routines. The disaster had been absorbed not just into history, but into habit. And so, long after the ship itself had lost its shape and long after the people who remembered it firsthand were gone, the aftermath continued in its most effective form: quiet, unremarkable, and largely unnoticed. By the time the 21st century settled in, the Titanic's aftermath had become almost entirely invisible. Its lessons were absorbed into maritime protocols, emergency training, and organizational thinking so thoroughly that few recognized their origin. The influence existed not as a story, but as an expectation. Procedures, redundancy, and caution were now baseline, taken for granted, quietly guiding decisions without fanfare. Ships were designed differently. Crew training incorporated scenarios that decades earlier would have seemed excessive. Communication systems were upgraded, not because people were dramatic, but because subtle lapses had once proven fatal. These adaptations were slow, deliberate, and incremental unexciting, yet remarkably durable. The disaster itself faded into the background, while its consequences continued silently. Public engagement with the Titanic remained focused on spectacle. Films, documentaries, exhibitions, and books emphasized the drama, the personalities, the heroic and tragic moments. The aftermath. The long, patient series of adjustments, grieving, and bureaucratic work was rarely portrayed. This was convenient, since it required patience to explain and listening to feel. Real aftermath is never flashy. Families continued to carry fragments of the story privately, objects inherited, tales retold in measured tones, quiet habits influenced by distant memory. Sometimes the story surfaced in conversation or during visits to museums. Most often it remained dormant, shaping perception without being acknowledged. Its influence persisted in the unspoken adjustments of daily life. Maritime scholars and historians still studied the sinking and its aftermath in detail. They traced procedural changes, regulatory evolution, and shifts in industry culture. In doing so, they revealed that survival, both for ships and for people, depended less on immediate heroics and more on long-term adaptation. The Titanic had taught a lesson in endurance and foresight rather than dramatic triumph. Meanwhile, the wreck continued its slow decay on the ocean floor. Expeditions documented its transformation, noting corroded metal, collapsed decks, and debris scattered over the seabed. This decay mirrored the fading of first-hand memory, precise, unavoidable, and indifferent. The Titanic itself, once an imposing marvel, was now a quiet collection of relics, preserved only in documentation and imagination. The public fascination, though still present, had settled into pattern recognition. References to the Titanic became shorthand for hubris and overconfidence, but the nuanced after-effects, grief management, procedural overhauls, subtle cultural shifts were mostly invisible. History had simplified the story, retaining clarity at the expense of completeness. What remained essential, however, was the quiet persistence of change. The Titanic influenced safety culture, risk assessment, and emergency preparedness. It shaped regulations, training protocols, and even casual expectations about what to do when things go wrong. These effects were pervasive, though rarely dramatic, and they endured long after attention faded. For survivors' descendants, these adjustments often went unnoticed. Procedures felt natural, precautions were routine. Subtle vigilance, inherited without explanation, carried forward. In this way, the Titanic's influence operated silently, embedding itself in the ordinary fabric of life rather than in its dramatic retellings. By the time the wreck became widely accessible in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it was appreciated more as an artifact than as a vessel of emotion. Cameras captured its remains. Researchers analyzed its structure. Curators displayed recovered objects. Each of these steps emphasized order, context, and understanding rather than immediate emotional impact. Through all this, the aftermath persisted, not as headlines, speeches, or monuments, but as enduring adjustment. A steady, quiet recalibration of systems, practices, and expectations. The event itself was past. The change it caused was present, ongoing, and often imperceptible. And so, even more than a century later, the Titanic's sinking and its aftermath demonstrate a peculiar truth. The consequences of disaster rarely end with the moment of catastrophe. They unfold in quiet increments, shape behavior subtly, and persist without spectacle, teaching lessons that are more about endurance than drama. As the years stretched further into the 21st century, the Titanic's aftermath had become almost entirely procedural. It existed in forms that no one outside maritime or safety professions would notice. Regulations, checklists, training exercises, and emergency protocols all carried the imprint of one night in 1912. These adjustments had a quiet durability. They persisted without comment, without ceremony, and without requiring public attention. In popular culture, the focus remained elsewhere. Films and documentaries emphasized heroism, tragedy, and romance. The bureaucracy, the lists, the committees, the incremental changes rarely appeared on screen. For viewers, the aftermath was compressed into a few sentences, often glossed over with phrases like "changes were made" or "lessons were learned." This was convenient because subtle, slow adaptation does not make for compelling drama. Nevertheless, the practical consequences continued. Shipping companies reviewed procedures annually, lifeboat drills were routine, communication equipment was tested. Ships were designed with margins that would have seemed excessive in 1912, yet these margins became standard. This quiet diligence was effective. It prevented repetition of the same mistakes without requiring constant attention to the historical source. Families connected to survivors carried the influence in even subtler ways. Behavioral habits, risk avoidance tendencies, and occasional family anecdotes kept the memory alive without dramatizing it. Some descendants sensed an unspoken caution about travel, confidence, or over-reliance on technology. They rarely understood why these tendencies existed, only that they felt necessary. Academic studies continued to document the aftermath in meticulous detail. Scholars traced procedural changes, studied patterns of human behavior, and analyzed regulatory evolution. Each paper added depth, but the general public engaged primarily with the spectacle. Understanding the slow, enduring impact of the Titanic required patience, a willingness to track decades of subtle influence, and attention to what rarely makes headlines. Meanwhile, the wreck itself continued its silent transformation. Pressure, corrosion, and microbial action reshaped the steel slowly. Expeditions recorded its decay carefully, mapping changes with precision. The ship, once an imposing engineering marvel, became a reminder of transience and impermanence. Its physical disappearance paralleled the fading of lived memory. At the same time, the Titanic remained a touchstone in discussions of hubris and overconfidence. Metaphors abounded. The unsinkable concept became a cautionary phrase invoked whenever confidence exceeded preparation. Yet these references rarely captured the practical aftermath, the detailed, incremental procedural lessons embedded in industry norms. For the general population, this detachment made the Titanic manageable. It was tragic, historically significant, but safely distant. People could study it, discuss it, or dramatize it without personal danger or emotional burden. Its influence persisted quietly in the background, shaping behavior indirectly without demanding attention. Even anniversaries, memorials, and museum exhibits contributed to this quieting. They focused on remembrance, acknowledgement, and education. They did not recreate the slow, laborious, and often tedious work of regulatory adaptation, grief processing, or procedural refinement. Yet that work, the real aftermath, continued, largely invisible to anyone not directly involved. Ultimately, the Titanic's legacy became less about spectacle and more about endurance. It was not the moments of disaster that had lasting effect, but the adjustments that followed. The patient, deliberate, and unglamorous work of preventing repetition, moderating confidence, and embedding vigilance into daily routines. The aftermath did its work quietly, reliably, and persistently. And so, even more than a century later, the Titanic's influence continues. Not as a story told in dramatic moments, but as a quiet architecture of caution, adaptation, and enduring awareness. Its lessons persist without fanfare, reminding us that the most important consequences are often the least visible. By now, the Titanic's aftermath had settled almost entirely into habit and expectation. For most people, the event was distant history, discussed occasionally in classrooms, documentaries, or anniversary articles. The drama of the sinking itself remained compelling, but the slow, incremental changes that followed had become almost invisible. Safety protocols, training exercises, and procedural checklists carried the lessons forward quietly, embedded into everyday operations. The impact on maritime culture was subtle but profound. Crew training became more rigorous, inspections more thorough, and redundancy was no longer optional. These changes, which had taken decades to implement fully, were rarely attributed explicitly to the Titanic in everyday conversation. They were treated as common sense, inherited wisdom, or industry standard. In this way, the aftermath persisted without fanfare, silently shaping decisions and expectations. For survivors' descendants, the Titanic existed as a background story. Some family members remembered anecdotes, objects, or faint impressions of lost relatives. Others learned of the disaster secondhand, through history books or media. Behavioral echoes, hesitation, caution, or wariness of overconfidence were passed down subtly, often without explanation. The influence of the event, though invisible, remained effective. Meanwhile, the wreck itself continued its gradual decay. Microbial activity, pressure, and corrosion reshaped its structure over the decades. Expeditions documented these changes meticulously, noting collapse and disintegration in ways that mirrored the fading of living memory. The physical deterioration was slow, patient, and inevitable, much like the quiet, procedural evolution of the human systems that had adapted after the disaster. In popular culture, the Titanic was repeatedly dramatized. Films, books, and exhibitions emphasized heroism, tragedy, and romance. The quiet, administrative, and long-term aftermath, the detailed procedural reforms, regulatory updates, and adjustments in maritime culture was largely ignored. Spectacle overshadowed subtlety, even though the latter held the real, enduring influence. Academic studies continued to explore the aftermath in careful detail. Scholars traced the evolution of maritime regulations, human behavior in crises, and institutional responses. They analyzed how lessons were integrated incrementally, often over decades, rather than as sudden transformations. This scholarship highlighted the difference between memorable narrative and practical effect, the real measure of the Titanic's influence. Even as public attention faded between commemorations, the Titanic's lessons persisted, policies were updated. Safety drills became routine, ship designs incorporated redundancy and reliability. The disaster had altered expectations permanently, though these changes remained largely invisible to those outside maritime or regulatory fields. The aftermath had quietly done its work. On a more personal level, subtle effects persisted in ways rarely recorded. Families adjusted habits, remembered cautionary tales, and maintained quiet vigilance in travel or emergency preparedness. These small inherited adaptations were indirect legacies of the disaster, unnoticed but effective. They were reminders that the consequences of tragedy do not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive as a background hum shaping thought and behavior. By this point, the Titanic had become not only a historical event, but a framework for understanding failure, adaptation, and human response. It existed in policy, procedure, and inherited caution, quietly shaping outcomes. The dramatic moment of sinking had long passed, but the true aftermath, long, patient, and understated, continued to influence lives and institutions alike. And so, even as time moved on and new tragedies captured attention, the Titanic's aftermath endured. Silent, procedural, and persistent, it served as a reminder that the most lasting consequences of disaster are often those that operate quietly, shaping behavior and expectation without fanfare, without spectacle, and without demand for recognition. Decades after the sinking, the Titanic's aftermath had become something almost imperceptible. It existed in expectations, in procedures, and in the quiet adaptations of maritime culture. For the general public, the event was a story to be retold, dramatized, or memorialized. For those in the industry, it was a set of rules and habits, quietly observed, tested, and refined. These procedures carried forward the lessons of that night without requiring anyone to consciously dwell on the event itself. The wreck, resting silently at the bottom of the Atlantic, continued its slow transformation. Steel corroded. Decks collapsed. Items once rigid and functional softened into unrecognizable forms. This physical decay mirrored the fading of first-hand memory. The ship, once alive with human endeavor, had become a silent lesson in impermanence, a reminder that time moves steadily, reshaping both matter and perception. In education and professional training, the Titanic was treated as an example of failure and adaptation. Students learned what went wrong, and professionals learned how to prevent recurrence. The aftermath, embedded in checklists and training drills, operated invisibly. The lessons were persistent, though largely unnoticed by those outside the field. Families connected to the disaster maintained subtler legacies. Personal stories, quiet habits, and unspoken caution persisted across generations. These indirect influences were rarely documented but shaped behaviors nonetheless. A cautious approach to risk, an emphasis on preparedness, and a respect for contingency plans were all small echoes of one night long past. Public fascination continued in fits and starts. Anniversaries prompted renewed attention. Exhibitions displayed artifacts. Documentaries reimagined events with varying degrees of fidelity. Yet the procedural, administrative, and emotional aftermath, the slow, enduring effects on lives and systems, remained largely invisible, quietly performing its work in the background. The Titanic's aftermath also influenced broader culture, albeit subtly. It became shorthand for hubris and overconfidence, often used metaphorically in unrelated contexts. These references carried little detail about actual consequences, but reflected an ingrained awareness that confidence should be balanced with caution. The event's influence persisted not through direct remembrance, but through indirect behavioral norms. Even technological progress echoed the lessons of Titanic. Innovations in safety, communication, and emergency preparedness were informed by the disaster's legacy. Redundancy, drill routines, and procedural oversight became standard practice. These adaptations were incremental, measured, and almost invisible, yet they fundamentally altered outcomes in ways that would prevent a repetition of past mistakes. The human dimension, meanwhile, quietly faded. Survivors aged and passed on, their experiences reduced to stories and documents. Descendants inherited fragments, not the full weight of the disaster. Objects, letters, and memories became artifacts of private significance, their lessons absorbed indirectly rather than through direct experience. Through all this, the Titanic became emblematic of a certain type of aftermath, slow, persistent, and invisible. Its most meaningful consequences were not in heroic rescues or dramatic survival, but in the quiet recalibration of expectations, procedures, and culture. The disaster itself had ended with the ship beneath the waves, but the ripples it created continued indefinitely, subtly guiding human behavior. And so, more than a century later, the Titanic's aftermath endured not as a story to be dramatized, but as a quiet, persistent force. It reminded us that true consequences are rarely immediate. They unfold gradually, shape habits and systems, and endure long after attention has moved elsewhere. In this way, the legacy of the Titanic was not its sinking, but the steady, understated influence that followed. By now, the Titanic's aftermath had become a quiet undercurrent in multiple spheres. The shipping industry, long accustomed to the lessons it imparted, carried forward adjustments as part of routine operations. Emergency preparedness was no longer a topic for debate, it was assumed. Checklists were reviewed regularly. Drills were conducted with mechanical consistency. These were the invisible threads of influence, woven into practice rather than narrative. In popular memory, however, the Titanic remained dramatic. Films, novels, and documentaries focused on the night of the sinking, the passengers, the heroics, and the tragedies. The slow, cumulative consequences, the painstaking work of regulation, the gradual reshaping of maritime culture, the subtle changes in personal behavior were rarely dramatized. They did not make for compelling storytelling. Yet they endured far longer than headlines. Families who had direct experience with the disaster continued to carry its weight, often quietly. Relatives remembered details: a lost shoe, a fragment of clothing, a half-told story. Habits, warnings, and small inherited cautionary tendencies persisted. These legacies were subtle and unrecognized by the broader world, yet they shaped behavior in ways both practical and lasting. The wreck itself continued to transform under the ocean's indifferent hand. Steel corroded, decks collapsed, and debris slowly scattered. Expeditions documented these changes meticulously, but the broader public often remained unaware of the incremental nature of decay. The passage of time erased much, yet also preserved just enough to continue informing those who observed carefully. Educationally, the Titanic was a case study in both disaster and adaptation. Students and professionals learned about human error, design limitations, and systemic failure. The regulatory aftermath changes to safety standards, mandatory drills, improvements in communication was emphasized in training, though the emotional dimensions were mostly omitted. This practical instruction ensured that the lessons endured in a form far more lasting than narrative drama. The cultural echoes of Titanic, meanwhile, became metaphoric shorthand. It symbolized hubris, overconfidence, and the dangers of ignoring warnings. These references rarely connected directly to the procedural aftermath, but they perpetuated awareness. People might invoke, like the Titanic, without knowing that its most lasting impact was procedural, quiet, and invisible. Technological evolution reinforced these lessons. Innovations in ship design, monitoring, and emergency systems reflected incremental adjustments informed by past failures. Safety was no longer theoretical. It was embedded in daily practice. The aftermath had migrated from the realm of narrative into the realm of function, persisting quietly through decades. Over time, survivors aged and passed away. Their stories became fragments, documented in books or preserved in artifacts rather than active experience. Descendants inherited subtle cues and habits rather than first-hand knowledge. Objects like letters, photographs, or personal effects acted as reminders of a disaster lived indirectly, influencing future generations silently. Ultimately, the Titanic's aftermath exemplified the slow, pervasive effect of large-scale disaster. It reshaped behavior, guided institutional practices, and informed expectations without demanding attention. Its influence persisted not as spectacle but as enduring structure and subtle caution. Even now, more than a century later, the Titanic's legacy is defined less by what was seen and remembered, and more by what quietly continues to function in the world. Its sinking was instantaneous, but its aftermath stretches forward indefinitely, a slow, persistent force shaping lives, systems, and expectations without fanfare, without drama, and without the need for constant recognition. By this point, the Titanic's aftermath had become almost entirely procedural and habitual. It no longer required conscious attention. Maritime authorities continued to review protocols, perform inspections, and conduct drills automatically as part of the standard operations of ships and crews. The lessons of 1912 were embedded into practice, quietly shaping behavior without fanfare or explicit reminder. In the public imagination, the Titanic remained a dramatic story, frozen in a night of ice, panic, and heroism. Books, films, and documentaries emphasized the visual and emotional elements of the sinking. The slow administrative and psychological aftermath. The long series of adjustments, the careful procedural reforms, the inherited caution was largely invisible to audiences. It worked quietly, but effectively. Families connected to the disaster maintained subtler legacies. Anecdotes, habits, and inherited cautiousness passed through generations. Descendants rarely knew the origin, yet they absorbed the influence. Behavioral echoes, reluctance toward risk, careful attention to preparation, subtle awareness of contingency remained, largely unremarked, but persistent. Meanwhile, the wreck continued its slow decay on the ocean floor. Pressure, corrosion, and microbial activity gradually reshaped its structure. Expeditions documented these changes, noting the collapse of decks, the loss of structural integrity, and the scattering of debris. This deterioration was patient, thorough, and indifferent, mirroring the fading of first-hand memory and the quiet embedding of procedural lessons. Educationally, the Titanic was used as an example of failure and systemic adaptation. Students and professionals studied it to understand human error, design flaws, and institutional responses. The procedural aftermath, new regulations, mandatory drills, and improved communication systems was emphasized in training, even as the dramatic elements captured public attention. The quiet, enduring impact of the disaster persisted largely unnoticed. Culturally, references to the Titanic continued to serve as metaphors for hubris and overconfidence. The story became shorthand for cautionary tales, though the real lessons were procedural and incremental. Technology and organizational practices evolved in response to the disaster, embedding its influence into the ongoing structure of maritime operations. Survivors aged and passed away, leaving behind fragments of memory preserved in stories, letters, and artifacts. Descendants inherited subtle cues, habits, and awareness rather than vivid recollections. The influence of the Titanic lived on in behavior, expectations, and institutional norms, quietly shaping lives without overt recognition. Ultimately, the Titanic's aftermath demonstrated how large-scale disasters influence not only immediate responses, but long-term practices and cultural norms. The dramatic events of the sinking captured attention, but the slow, pervasive, and procedural consequences were far more enduring. They taught caution, resilience, and adaptation, operating silently and persistently across generations. Even more than a century later, the Titanic's legacy is defined less by spectacle and more by the quiet, steady influence of its aftermath. Procedures, expectations, and behaviors continue to reflect its lessons, working invisibly yet effectively. The sinking was instantaneous, but the consequences unfolded slowly, persistently, and without fanfare. By now, the Titanic's aftermath had become fully integrated into the routines of maritime life, nearly invisible to the casual observer. Ships operated with layers of safety protocols, crew training was systematic, and emergency procedures were standardized. What had once been a dramatic reaction to disaster was now an automatic, almost mundane series of practices. The lessons of that night in 1912 were no longer debated, they were quietly enforced. In the broader culture, the Titanic remained a compelling narrative. Films, books, and exhibitions emphasized the suspense, heroism, and tragedy of the sinking. Yet the procedural aftermath, the careful, slow adaptations in regulations, operational norms, and human behavior remained largely unseen. These quiet changes were the ones that actually prevented repetition, persisting without the need for recognition or dramatization. Families of survivors continued to carry subtle influences. Stories passed down, minor habits, and precautionary behaviors reflected the disaster's long-term effect. Descendants often had no explicit memory of the event, yet behaviors shaped by it endured. Small, inherited cautionary measures became second nature, a silent legacy of the night that the public remembers as drama rather than process. The wreck itself continued its patient decay under the ocean's indifferent hand. Steel corroded, decks collapsed, and debris slowly scattered across the seabed. Expeditions documented the deterioration carefully, noting subtle changes over years. The ship's slow erosion mirrored the fading of personal memory and the quiet embedding of lessons into institutions. Education and training emphasized these outcomes, but usually through abstraction. Students and professionals learned about safety improvements, systemic failures, and human error. The emphasis was procedural, not emotional. drama was compressed into anecdotes. The enduring practical aftermath was conveyed through checklists, drills, and regulations. These were the true, long-lasting results of the tragedy. Culturally, the Titanic became shorthand for hubris, overconfidence, and the failure of assumptions. Yet these references rarely captured the real mechanisms of change, the incremental, persistent procedural and institutional adjustments that shaped behavior over decades. The story became symbolic while the consequences operated quietly in the background. Even as the survivors aged and passed away, the legacy endured. Objects, letters, and family anecdotes acted as faint reminders, influencing descendants indirectly. Behaviors, expectations, and cautious habits carried forward often without explanation. The disaster had shaped a culture of awareness and procedural diligence that persisted long after the drama faded. Ultimately, the Titanic's aftermath illustrates how disasters propagate effects over time. Immediate spectacle attracts attention, but it is the gradual, quiet adjustments that endure. Systems change, behaviors shift, institutions adapt. This is the slow, drowsy reality of consequence, unfolding without announcement, without drama, and without need for recognition. The sinking was a single decisive event. Its aftermath was not. It persists quietly, invisibly, shaping practice, expectation, and cultural memory in ways that are subtle but enduring. The Titanic's legacy is less the drama of loss and more the slow, persistent work of adaptation that continues to this day. By the middle of the 21st century, the Titanic's aftermath had become almost entirely procedural, embedded in the rhythms of maritime practice. Regulations were followed automatically. Drills were conducted as a matter of routine. Crew training incorporated scenarios that had once seemed extraordinary, now considered standard. The disaster's lessons had quietly settled into habit, influencing behavior without spectacle or deliberate acknowledgement. In public perception, the Titanic remained dramatic. Films and documentaries highlighted the night of the sinking, the heroism, and the tragedy. These retellings rarely addressed the prolonged aftermath, the administrative reforms, regulatory adjustments, and subtle behavioral changes that persisted over decades. Yet it was these quiet, unglamorous shifts that ensured the survival of lessons learned. Descendants of survivors carried subtler legacies. Family stories, small inherited habits, and cautious approaches to risk reflected the event's enduring influence. Most descendants did not consciously associate these behaviors with the disaster, yet they were shaped by its consequences, passing along a quiet, indirect inheritance of awareness and caution. Meanwhile, the wreck itself continued its patient decay. Corrosion and microbial activity reshaped the structure slowly, steadily, and thoroughly. Decks collapsed, railings crumbled, and debris scattered across the seabed. The deterioration mirrored the fading of first-hand memory, a slow transformation paralleling the quiet embedding of procedural and cultural lessons. In education and professional training, the Titanic was used to illustrate systemic failure and adaptation. Students studied human error, design limitations, and institutional responses. Procedural improvements enhanced safety regulations, mandatory drills, and improved communication protocols were emphasized. These measures were enduring, practical, and often invisible, operating quietly alongside the more dramatic narrative of the sinking itself. Culturally, references to the Titanic persisted as symbols of overconfidence and hubris. They were shorthand for cautionary tales, though they rarely captured the procedural aftermath. Nevertheless, these indirect influences reinforced awareness. Repetition in language and metaphor served as a subtle echo of a disaster that had long since ceased to be immediate. Technological progress reflected the lessons learned. Ship designs, monitoring systems, and emergency procedures all incorporated incremental adjustments inspired by the disaster. Safety became embedded in standard practice. These outcomes, though unremarkable in appearance, were profound in effect. They demonstrated how slow, quiet adaptations can outlast immediate drama in shaping behavior and outcomes. Even as the original survivors passed away, their experiences continued to influence descendants and institutions alike. Artifacts, letters, and family stories preserved fragments of the past, allowing lessons to persist in subtle, indirect ways. Behavioral habits and expectations were quietly inherited, providing an enduring, though largely unrecognized, legacy. Ultimately, the Titanic's aftermath illustrates the enduring power of quiet influence. While dramatic events capture attention, it is the slow, procedural, and persistent adjustments that truly shape the future. The sinking itself was instantaneous. Its consequences unfolded over decades, silently and steadily. The Titanic's legacy is not in the spectacle of tragedy, but in the enduring, unremarkable, and quiet work of adaptation. Its lessons persist, guiding behavior, shaping institutions, and influencing culture without demand for recognition, without dramatization, and without the need for spectacle. By this stage, the Titanic's aftermath had become fully diffused into practice, memory, and culture. Regulations, safety procedures, and training routines had absorbed its lessons so completely that few thought consciously about their origin. The event itself existed mostly in story and symbolism, while the practical outcomes, the careful calibration of behavior, systemic adjustments, and inherited caution, continued quietly without notice. For the public, the Titanic was dramatic, tragic, and iconic. Films, novels, and documentaries highlighted heroism, panic, and human vulnerability. Yet the slow administrative and procedural work that ensured future maritime safety went largely unremarked. It operated quietly, unnoticed, but persistently shaping decisions and expectations. Families of survivors continued to carry subtle legacies, stories passed down, minor habits, and inherited caution reflected the long-term effects of the disaster. Descendants often had no conscious connection to the event, yet behaviors shaped by it endured. These quiet influences shaped personal decisions, emergency preparedness, and risk awareness across generations. Meanwhile, the wreck itself continued its patient decay. Pressure, corrosion, and microbial activity reshaped the ship over decades. Decks collapsed, railings weakened, objects scattered. Expeditions recorded these changes carefully, but the process was slow, meticulous, and indifferent. The physical erosion mirrored the fading of memory and the subtle embedding of lessons into institutions. In education and professional training, the Titanic remained a case study. Students and professionals learned about human error, design flaws, and institutional response. The emphasis was procedural rather than emotional. Checklists, drills, and regulations carried the lessons forward, quietly ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, even if public attention remained focused on the drama of the sinking itself. Cultural references continued to frame the Titanic as a cautionary tale. It symbolized hubris and overconfidence, though these references rarely reflected the detailed, long-term adjustments that were its true legacy. The disaster's most enduring effects were procedural, embedded in daily practice, and largely invisible. Even as survivors passed away, their experiences persisted indirectly. Artifacts, letters, and family anecdotes maintained fragments of memory. Behavioral cues and inherited caution remained, subtly shaping the attitudes and decisions of future generations. These legacies operated quietly, without ceremony or recognition. Ultimately, the Titanic's aftermath demonstrates the slow, enduring nature of real consequences. Immediate drama captures attention, but it is the long, quiet work procedures, habits, and systemic adaptations that truly endures. The disaster itself was instantaneous, but its effects stretched across decades, quietly guiding behavior and shaping outcomes. Its legacy is not in spectacle or narrative, but in persistent adaptation. Procedures, expectations, and cultural habits continued to reflect its influence, quietly operating in the background. The Titanic sank once, but its aftermath persists indefinitely, subtly, steadily, and without demand for recognition. By now, the Titanic's aftermath had settled almost entirely into invisibility. Its most important effects, procedural reforms, behavioral adjustments, and institutional memory, had been absorbed into the routine of maritime operations and public consciousness. For most people, the Titanic was a story, a lesson in hubris, a cautionary metaphor. The real work of adaptation, though far more consequential, was quiet, incremental, and largely unnoticed. Maritime procedures, now standardized, bore the imprint of that night long ago. Lifeboat drills, emergency communications, safety inspections, all were regular, unremarkable parts of daily practice. No one marveled at their origin. They simply existed, operating effectively and persistently. A legacy of careful adaptation rather than dramatic spectacle. Families connected to the disaster maintained subtler legacies. Stories were retold sparingly, habits of caution persisted. Descendants often inherited behavioral tendencies without knowing their origin. These quiet influences shaped lives in ways rarely recorded, embedding the memory of the disaster into everyday decision-making and expectations. Meanwhile, the wreck continued its patient decay. Corrosion, microbial activity, and pressure slowly reshaped its structure. Decks collapsed, railings crumbled, and debris scattered. Expeditions documented these changes meticulously, but the process was unhurried, indifferent, and thorough. The physical deterioration mirrored the fading of living memory and the quiet embedding of lessons into human systems. Education and professional training emphasized the Titanic as a case study in failure and adaptation. Students and professionals learned about human error, design limitations, and systemic reforms. Checklists, drills, and regulations carried the lessons forward, quietly ensuring mistakes would not recur. even as popular attention remained focused on the dramatic events of the night itself. Cultural references, meanwhile, reinforced the disaster's symbolic weight, like the Titanic became shorthand for overconfidence or hubris, though these references rarely reflected the nuanced procedural aftermath. The disaster's influence persisted indirectly, shaping expectations, guiding behavior, and embedding caution, often without overt recognition. Even as survivors aged and passed away, their influence persisted. Letters, photographs, and family stories preserved fragments of the past. Behavioral patterns, subtle risk awareness, and quiet attention to preparedness endured, shaping decisions and expectations across generations. Ultimately, the Titanic's aftermath demonstrates the slow, pervasive nature of real consequences. While dramatic events attract attention, it is the quiet, procedural, and enduring adjustments that shape future outcomes. The sinking itself was instantaneous. The consequences unfolded steadily, persistently, and largely invisibly. And so, even more than a century later, the Titanic's legacy is not found in spectacle or drama, but in quiet adaptation. It continues to shape behavior, institutions, and cultural memory without announcement, fanfare, or demand for recognition. Its lessons endure quietly, steadily, and unobserved. Finally, in the long, slow unfolding of time, the Titanic's aftermath settled into near invisibility, yet remained quietly pervasive. The dramatic events of that night faded into history, memorialized in films, books, and exhibitions, while the real legacy, the patient work of adaptation, regulation, and subtle cultural influence, persisted without notice. It existed not in headlines, but in procedures, expectations, and inherited behaviors. Maritime operations continued to reflect lessons learned more than a century ago. Safety drills, emergency protocols, and communication procedures had become standard practice, operating automatically, quietly, and effectively. The changes had been so deeply integrated that their origin in a single night of disaster was largely forgotten, yet their influence persisted in every decision made at sea. For families of survivors, traces of the Titanic endured in small, almost imperceptible ways. Stories passed down, habits inherited, and subtle cautionary behaviors influenced generations. Descendants rarely recognized the connection, yet they carried the quiet legacy of one night in the North Atlantic, encoded into daily life and practical judgment. The wreck itself continued its slow transformation. Corrosion, pressure, and microbial activity gradually reshaped its structure. Decks collapsed, and debris scattered across the seabed. Expeditions documented these changes carefully, but time remained the quiet arbiter, indifferent to attention or preservation. The physical decay mirrored the fading of memory and the silent embedding of lessons into human systems and institutional routines. Educational and professional contexts preserved the procedural lessons of the disaster. Students and maritime professionals studied human error, design limitations, and systemic failure. Checklists, drills, and regulations became the most enduring and effective outcomes of the Titanic, ensuring that similar mistakes were unlikely to be repeated. These lessons were quiet, uncelebrated, and persistently effective. Culturally, the Titanic became shorthand for hubris, overconfidence, and misplaced trust. These references rarely encompassed the procedural, administrative, and generational consequences that constituted the true aftermath. Yet even indirect awareness influenced behavior, subtly reminding people of risk, preparedness, and the value of diligence. Ultimately, the Titanic's aftermath illustrates the slow, enduring nature of real consequences. While immediate drama captures attention, the quiet, procedural, and persistent adaptations shape outcomes far more effectively. The disaster itself was instantaneous, but its ripple effects unfolded steadily, persistently, and invisibly. More than a century later, the Titanic's legacy exists in these quiet continuities. Procedures, institutional memory, and subtle inherited behaviors endure without fanfare or recognition. The sinking was a single tragic event, but its aftermath is ongoing, pervasive, and understated, quietly guiding decisions, shaping culture, and teaching lessons that time itself enforces. And with that, the story of the Titanic's aftermath comes to rest slowly, quietly, without spectacle, leaving only the steady imprint of change.